You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com and 97.3 ESPN. Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com and 97.3 ESPN. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Jeff Quake. Today, we will put a wrap on the offseason, at least the portion that we can discuss following free agency, at least the first couple days of it anyway. And yes, there are still a little more than 2 months left before training camps begin and the preseason arrives, but the bulk of the offseason work is essentially over, and the teams are really now starting to take shape. Monday was a relatively quiet day for the Flyers. I say relatively because the Flyers did make 8 signings, which may actually be more than most teams did on Monday, but nothing of real major significance. These were mainly depth players to fill out the AHL roster and be potential NHL fill-ins if injuries should arise. So if nothing really noteworthy happened on Monday, what do we have to talk about this week? Well, we're going to look at where the Flyers stand after the opening of free agency. So we'll look at some of the moves from other teams, particularly in the Metropolitan Division in the Eastern Conference, and really just put a wrap on things before we take a break for the next few months until we get to September. So there's a really lengthy list of players here, and it goes beyond 8 players that got two-way contracts or one-way contracts. There were minor league deals being made, more of them coming out on day 2 of free agency on Tuesday. Kind of interesting because the Phantoms are going to have a completely different looking team, just about anyway. But it was a decent amount of activity, but not the activity that a lot of people were looking for. I think people thought there might have been a little bit of cap space to squeeze something out to help the current roster. And we talked about a few targets last week and trying to keep it realistic and trying to be mindful of the fact that there was probably not room to make some major splash here. And it just seems like there's a lot of people that still were desiring something, knowing that there's three restricted free agents, I should say, that are still out there waiting to be signed, and you don't have a ton of cap space left. You've got a significant amount on paper, but realistically, you know that 2 of these players are going to make a big chunk of money, and we talked about those deals as well last week. So Jeff, why don't I just pitch it over to you to start with, and we'll just, run down these players for us a little bit and give us kind of an idea here as to, these depth players and some things like that, so we can kind of knock that out before we get into the heart of the matter here, which is looking at the current NHL team and where this team goes and some of the other signings as well on a crazy first day of free agency.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. And like you said, all of these moves, they're basically depth moves for the Flyers signings, and a majority of them, if not all of them, will be in the Lehigh Valley Phantoms in the AHL. The only 2 players that really stick out to me that could actually be in the NHL at some point, either due to injury or just a call up just because. Andy Andreoff, and the other was Cal O'Reilly. Andreoff, he spent the last few years with the LA Kings, didn't put up a whole lot of points, played a decent amount of games, but he's really the only one that sticks out besides, like I said, Cal O'Reilly. O'Reilly was the captain of the Iowa Wild, which is Minnesota Wild's farm team. And the other notable name that kind of stuck out to me, it's not, again, the one thing that kind of bothered me was that a lot of Flyers fans were actually expecting like a big splash. Not necessarily saying Artemi Panarin, but a bigger splash than all of these depth moves. Unfortunately, because of the Flyers cap space, they weren't able to sign any of these bigger names. And again, they kind of all did all of their free agent signing or free agent moves earlier in the offseason with, of course, the Kevin Hayes acquisition, the Justin Braun and Matt Niskanen acquisitions as well. But the other name was Jean-Francois Berube to a 1-year, 2-way contract. He's a goalie. But, and the other point you did mention was that this is going to be a very different Lehigh Valley Phantoms team. I think it's going to be a much stronger team than last year. And the one big factor in which I'm excited about for O'Reilly for on the Phantoms, that is simply because he will be a great player for some of the younger players who are on the bubble of making the Flyers, such as Morgan Frost, Joel Farabee, German Rubasov, possibly Mikhail Vorobiev, or any of his players, or just whoever he would play on a line with, to get their scoring ability up.
Yeah, I see O'Reilly as the perfect fill-in for Colin McDonald, who's probably not coming back at this point. And I think he takes the place of a guy like that very well. He can be that veteran leader for that team. I was thrilled to see that Greg Carey got a contract as well, because he's a fan favorite in Allentown. People love him up there, and I think that that's something that's significant as well. Otherwise, yeah, it wasn't really anything significant, but I wrote about this on Tuesday, kind of putting a wrap on free agency a little bit, because it is really very much a one day type of thing. Every team, and this goes for anybody out there. The New York Rangers are making a bet on Artemi Panarin. How so? The Rangers are making a bet on Panarin with the amount of money they're spending on him per year, in the hopes that he performs the way that he has for his entire career, that he doesn't get hurt. You make a bet on that player. And some of them are more, they're all calculated risks in one way or another. And in a case like the Rangers giving a contract to Panarin, you know what kind of player you're getting. So yes, it's a bigger bet, but it's, in terms of money, but it's less of a risk, I would say. Now, that being said, if every player is a bet, then the Flyers place theirs in June, not July. That's the real difference here. It's not like they didn't go out and make additions. Their additions were the trade and signing of Kevin Hayes, who would have been one of the big names in free agency on Monday and wasn't there because the Flyers took care of that business much earlier than July 1st. They traded for Matt Niskanen and Justin Braun. They traded for Tyler Pitlick. They brought back Brian Elliott. And that's what Chuck Fletcher thinks will be an upgrade next season, and that is the part that remains to be seen. That's the bet, the gamble. It's putting out there that Kevin Hayes is going to make a difference on this second line. Matt Niskanen and Justin Braun give you more veteran presence on the blue line, help you prevent more goals. That comes into play. Brian Elliott's the perfect backup for Carter Hart. That's your gamble there. And Brian Elliott's not going to get hurt like he has in the past few years, because it is a different role maybe. Pitlick's going to fit right in on the fourth line. Those are the gambles that you have to take as a general manager when you make trades and sign contracts. And I think it's ironic that that every name that we mentioned, aside from Brian Elliott, was acquired via a trade. Even Kevin Hayes, who technically goes down as kind of a trade/signing. The challenge to me for this team coming up is that in September and October, they have to very quickly establish some sort of identity, because, here's what I'll say, and then I'll pitch it back to you, Jeff, to kind of fill in here and give your thoughts on kind of the offseason as a whole, or as much as we have so far. That's the challenge to me, is that they have to be a good team at the start of the year. They have to perform effective immediately. And I'll be honest, I don't know if the Flyers are a better team than they were last season. And I say that in this sense. There's really no sense in trying to guess if they are right now, trying to compare them to any other team in the league, any team from years past on paper, because it's all paper. Yeah, I remember looking at the team last season, seeing a forward line combination that included Claude Giroux, Sean Couturier, and Travis Konechny. Another line that combined James Van Riemsdyk, Nolan Patrick, and Jake Voracek. Another line that combined Wayne Simmons, Oscar Lindblom, and Mikhail Vorobiev made a push and got in there on the third line for a little bit. Fourth line that had Scott Lawton and Michael Raffel, and a defensive group that had Shane Gostisbehere, Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, Radko Gudas, Robert Haig, and having a belief that Brian Elliott and Michael Neuwirth were going to be able to stay healthy, and looking at that roster on paper in, say, August or September, and thinking, this should be a playoff team. I'm not going to do that this season, and there's players that are returning, primarily the younger ones. You know, they need to be the ones that make you believe that this team is better. And I'll believe that when I see it, but I think the potential is there for them to be better. And I think it's also very unfair to start to look ahead, look at the team on paper, try to judge whether it's a playoff team or not, or has a chance to win a series or not, when you can't even come close to comparing this season on the same parameters as last season. Because last season is a team that was constructed by Ron Hextall, coached by Dave Haxtell for half a season. And when Chuck Fletcher took over, his job at that time was not to save last season. It was to start getting ready for this season. So this is not a team coming up this year that's going to be coached by Dave Hextall. It's a team that's going to be coached by Elaine Vigneault. And so let's just see what happens. I'm not going to sit here and say this team is for sure and certain a playoff team, and I'm not going to sit here and say they're not a playoff team. If they the bottom line is if they come out and they go through October and struggle out of the gate, and by Thanksgiving you're playing catch up just like you did for the last 5 seasons, then we can talk about how this offseason was or wasn't good enough because we'll have an idea. But paper is paper. On paper, you don't have to be impressed with what the Flyers did this offseason. You do not have to be impressed by what Chuck Fletcher did. I'm not overly impressed. There's for a lot of reasons. I'm not overly impressed because there are a lot of it that are the same parts. I see Claude Giroux, I see Jake Voracek, I see guys like that, and you go, okay, it's those guys again. They have to be the ones who turn it around. I look at the move for Kevin Hayes, and I think that's an upgrade. I look at the moves for Niskanen and Braun, and I think, well, you're taking a gamble that you're hoping they bounce back. And if they do, it's going to look great. And if they don't, it's not going to look so good. But let's at least see how this turns out for everybody involved, for the kids on the team, for the veterans on the team with a different coach, a team that's going to have way more stability in goal with Carter Hart and hopefully a healthy Brian Elliott in a backup 1B role and more veterans on defense that could prove to be the difference. That's where I am with this. And trying to look at this from a perspective where you don't announce that a team is winning something out of free agency because you still have to play the games. If this team isn't a playoff team and everybody is so certain of it, then why do we play 82 games? That's all I'm going to say about that. But I'm not going to sit here and I'm also not going to sit here and try to glaze everything over and act like what they did was more impressive than what other teams did. You got to play the games. We've got to see what this is like from everything top down. They changed coaches. They've changed general managers in the last year, and he has put together this team with clearly a veteran presence method in mind. Putting veterans on this team to guide the young players, putting a coach in place who wants to guide players to success. If those things happen and they get the goaltending as well, which I definitely have a point about Carter Hart that I want to make when it comes to the rest of the division coming up. But you put all those pieces together, and I think you have a team that should be better. But I don't want to go out there and proclaim that necessarily because there's a lot of reasons that we could sit here and say things like that and then have it all come back and be blown up in your face because they come out and they have another slow start and look like they're not prepared. So it's now on the players at this point who have been brought here to be a different team when the season starts in October. And if they can do that, I think you get everybody kind of interested again. I don't think anybody is more interested than they were a year ago based on what they did in the offseason. But I do think that the recipe for success or to bring people in is winning, is to have success. So if they go out and they prove that they can be that team, you'll have people buying in again. But I think it was just too there's nothing wrong with what they did. It's a solid offseason, but there wasn't really, aside from Hayes, and even then, that wasn't viewed as a crazy substantial move because I think everybody got fascinated with the idea that a Panarin was available, something like that. So I think that that's the thing that people get lost in. So, Jeff, your thoughts on kind of where this team is now following the last let's say probably the last month and a half as they've made some re-signings, as they've brought in these new players, and now they kind of can set focus on on going into next season kind of because the rest of the summer is probably about signing Ivan Provorov, signing Travis Konechny, signing Scott Lawton, and going into training camp to figure out the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. My biggest takeaway is that the farm system in the AHL that instantly got better. It's a much different look because uh, look at how many injuries the Flyers had last year. You had guys like Tyrell Goulbourne filling in. I think you had Mikhail Vorobiev for a little bit. I don't believe so, but possibly Nicholas Aube-Kubel, which I don't have a problem with Knack. I think he's a good player and he has a potential opportunity to make the team. But you had all these younger guys in the AHL that weren't necessarily difference makers. Because I remember at one point the Flyers called up Tyrell Goulbourne, trying to make a difference. A few different times throughout the season, and at that point, it's the kind of the main question was simply just why this doesn't make sense. Goulbourne, he's an energy type player, but he's not going to make that big of a difference to change a team. Some of those players are out. I know Goulbourne, he signed somewhere. I believe Cole Bardreau might have signed somewhere as well. The other players that are out in general, Radko Gudas, Andrew McDonald, Cam Talbot, the players, of course, that brought in Matt Niskanen, Justin Braun, Kevin Hayes. I think the defensive aspect, all in all, over this offseason so far, I'm pretty thrilled with it. And the fact that Fletcher kind of went, backtracked a little bit and thought, okay, I gave up a second and a third for Justin Braun. He then got that second round pick back in the draft by trading back a couple picks. Of course, he used that second round pick to grab Bobby Brink, good pick there. And you don't have to worry about, McDonald in your defensive core anymore. Radko Gudas, I think he played some of his best hockey in his entire career last year in Philadelphia. Some can certainly argue that, but that's just my opinion. But the defensive core this year, it's exciting. Excuse me. It's exciting. And yet at the same time, it's getting a little full. And that's what the only thing that worries me a bit is because there's going to be players, fighting for spots, which is fine. But right now, unless the Flyers bang a trade, they have 8 defensemen unless they decide to either scratch 2 of them or keep one healthy, scratch the other in the minors. Because right now you have Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, Matt Niskanen, Shane Gostisbehere, Justin Braun, Robert Haig. You have Sam Marin and also Phil Myers. All 8 defensemen there. They're going to make a difference. It's going to be at least in my opinion, it should be a better difference than last year's defensive core. But the one thing that you did bring up though, Kevin, is you can't. And I definitely agree with this. Is you can't necessarily judge this team too early, and you can't try to predict where they're going to be. I know I did that last year, and I was completely off. But you kind of got to see how it pans out. All I will say about this team though is you have a better defensive core. I don't know how much better it is, but I on paper, I like this defensive core a little bit better than last year's paper. The team on paper for the defense, you got more experienced guys, more experienced veterans, and more right-handed shots on the blue line, which is always needed for the Flyers. And then for the young forwards, you have Nolan Patrick. He's going to be on the third line, and that's probably the best thing that could happen to Patrick right now because he is a strong second line center in Kevin Hayes in front of him. He can learn more from Hayes. And also, teams are going to be focusing so much on Hayes, I feel like, this year that it's not like they're going to forget about Nolan Patrick. It's just Hayes, I think, is going to make a big enough difference where it's going to distract teams just enough where Patrick can kind of do his own thing and dominate the ice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I kept coming back to about this too is, there's the Flyers could have gone out and gotten another impact forward, or found a way to make a deal with an impact forward, whether it was through trade or through free agency. And the probable cost of doing something like that, if you would have had them sign somebody yesterday, or sign somebody on Monday, or uh, sign somebody earlier in the year, trade for somebody, whatever it may be. If you would have had, if you would have done that, the cost is probably going to be Shane Gostisbehere. I'd like to see Shane Gostisbehere play on this particular team for 2 reasons. The first is I want to truly see if the coaching makes a difference with him, because I don't know that I ever got to see anything close to what, I look at last season and all the problems that there were with last season, and I do think that some of that came down to Dave Haxtell and a little bit Scott Gordon too, in the sense that, Scott Gordon was probably in there as damage control at that point to try to do something with the rest of the season as a coach. And I don't think there was ever a fit in Dave Haxtell's system with Shane Gostisbehere and the freedom he needs to have to be able to play his way. He, for whatever reason, he had that confidence and played that way in year 1 and year 3 and didn't in year 2 and year 4. Those years are a thing of the past, and the coach who was in charge during those years is a thing of the past. So I'd like to see him in Alain Vigneault's system, for one. Two, I'd like to see him as the third pairing guy that people think he's going to be, because you assume that Provorov and Sanheim are going to be left side pairing 1 and pairing 2, and Niskanen and Braun slot in as your two guys on the top 4 as well on the right side as right-handed shots. So Gostisbehere possibly moves to the third pairing. What that does is you can essentially start to maybe limit some of his even strength ice time and use him almost as a power play specialist meets third line regular, in a sense, third pairing regular. He gets the third pairing minutes, gets a boost in minutes when they play on the power play. Maybe he's a little bit fresher for the power play. It changes his dynamic a little bit. It makes him more of an impact player on the power play than when he has to play every role that he was in the top 4 the year before. So maybe you get the best of him as opposed to trying to rely on him to be this 17 to 20 minute guy who is not, who you may even have had to throw in on a penalty kill every now and then a year ago because you were just out of options. And it lets him be used more naturally. And I think that that's very important, to use him in the right way and to give him another shot with this particular team, to see if he plays better with the different players that are coming in, to see if he plays better under Alain Vigneault. And after that, maybe you can judge that he's just not working out the way that you think he was. But for right now, you've got him on a very cap-friendly contract at his age, at his experience, at his potential, which is very clearly 60 points in a season. He has the potential to do it. It's just a matter of him finding that consistency. So I like that he's still around. And I like the fact that at the end of the day, what Chuck Fletcher kind of came out and said was they weren't going to make a deal that boxed somebody in. And I don't think I don't think they really have, quite frankly. I look at even the Kevin Hayes deal, which is 7 years. I don't see that blocking anybody in particular. It's giving them more stability now, so Nolan Patrick can be in the third line and kind of grow on his own terms a little bit here, and not be pressured to be the second line, do it all, and be a key contributor offensively too. You get to comfortably sit him in the third line. Hayes is in the second line, and when Nolan Patrick's ready to take the jump, you can either flip-flop them and move Hayes down to the third line, or Hayes can also possibly slot over into a wing spot as other guys start to either filter out, or however you want to do this, however you see fit, you can move these guys around a little bit and it might work out in your favor big time. So I even look at that and I see a short-term implication with Hayes. The other guys, Niskanen's got 2 years left on his contract. Braun's got 1. Pitlick was a 1-year deal. None of these guys are blocking anybody from being part of this team. And not only that, but you didn't go out and you didn't spend foolishly and give, I try to look at some of the guys that maybe we had talked about last week as free agency was about to start. And I think of guys like Brent Connolly and, guys like that, and Jonas Donskoy getting 4-year deals. The money was not really the issue in those deals. I think they made perfectly adequate money for what their role is going to be with their new teams. But I almost wonder if you're looking, because I look at the I think they each made $3.5 million roughly per year. I think Donskoy was a little higher at 3.9. But bottom line being, those guys were in that price range, and I don't think the Flyers could even afford to go above 3, let alone 3.5. And beside the point, I don't think they wanted to go anywhere close to 4 years, because it's essentially trying to tie a guy into your bottom 6 for the next 4 years. Ron Hextall made a deal like that with Dale Weiss, and it ended up not working out in the slightest. So I think you want to make sure that your options are open, and maybe what you do for the rest of the offseason here is you keep your eyes peeled on a couple of these players who are not signed yet, who may need time to sign with somebody, who may not be the hottest ticket. And you see if later on down the road, if they're really desperate for an opportunity, then you sign a guy like that to, a player who's out there maybe looking for a job, to a 1-year low-cost deal. And maybe it comes after you've taken care of Provorov and Konechny and all of those guys. And if you do that, you finally get yourself in a position where that guy is in the competition just like everybody else and not tying down the situation. Ultimately, I still see the vacant third line winger spot that's still kind of out there. Ultimately, I see that being something that favors guys like Morgan Frost and Joel Farabee, guys who are going to come into this competition. I almost wonder a little bit, and I wrote about this as well. I wonder if Chuck Fletcher was watching at development camp and got the sense from watching Morgan Frost right now or Joel Farabee right now or somebody out there, maybe it's Rubtsov, maybe it's Ratcliffe, maybe it's somebody like that, that there's enough guys who are going to compete for this that one of them's going to prove he's ready. And maybe Chuck Fletcher in his head is sitting there on Saturday afternoon when the 5-on-5 scrimmage is happening, or Friday when they did the 3-on-3 tournament and going, I don't need to do anything on Monday about the current roster. I'm going to get a player from in-house who's a kid who's motivated to go play and be a part of the NHL right now, and someone's going to show me something in September, and I'm putting my trust in that. I almost wonder if that's where his mindset was. So maybe after that, I look at all the other things that could have happened in free agency and all the other things that did happen throughout the rest of the league, and maybe if you're Chuck Fletcher, you go, I don't care. I took care of my additions already. I've got kids who are ready to come up at some point here. I'm not going to do anything drastic, and I'm going to let everything play out. I think it was a kind of a smart strategy to not get tied down again, because the only thing that they did this entire offseason that really ties them down is the Kevin Hayes contract. That's it. Other than that, I think he had a smart strategy of finding legitimate potential upgrades at these positions on short-term contracts that even if they are paying a lot, Niskanen is no cheap contract by any stretch, but it is only a 2-year deal. And Bronze isn't cheap either, but it's a 1-year deal. And if it sets yourself up for next offseason to be a player again, I think I'd rather see you potentially come back as a player next year than worry about what you didn't do this offseason. Everybody wanted to see some sort of change. You got your change. You're going to see 2 new defensemen. You're going to see a new forward, probably actually more than that. Because you're going to see 2 new forwards with Hayes and Pitlick, plus probably a third if someone slots in on that third line who wasn't playing for the Flyers last year, and that could very well be somebody like Morgan Frost. And you're going to see Carter Hart for a full year. I think that there is a way for this team to be successful. It's just a matter of them actually going out and executing under a new system.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more because, and we'll start kind of on the topic we're just talking about here with all the, the what the forwards could look like and everything. Obviously, Kevin Hayes is going to be on the second line, and I think that's going to benefit Nolan Patrick on the third line, who most likely will be paired with Lindblom. And just a couple of days ago, I think I saw somewhere on social media that Chuck Fletcher was pretty excited about Joel Farabee and Morgan Frost, and like you said, there's a good chance that one, if not even both players, could make the team. Now, I don't know if you would put Frost on the third line and Farabee on the fourth line, or vice versa, or just one of them makes the team. Either way, Fletcher clearly has some sort of plan in mind. He got his guys early in the offseason. Before the Stanley Cup Finals was even over, he got, Braun and he got Hayes. And the final pieces of the puzzle was, of course, free agency. But that was more so depth moves, for the Phantoms. And that's totally fine. They're going to be a better team. For Tyler Pitlick, now I personally don't know where he could be. It's either going to be the fourth line or just a healthy scratch. That's just my opinion. I don't know much about him, but right away though, I think the fact that you have Scott Lund, who scored a career high in goals, assists, and points all last year, he's centering your fourth line. That's a great depth, fourth line already with him, Michael Rothel, and then you could have Tyler Pitlick or one of the younger guys. But regardless, though, Ryan Hartman, he's gone. So the moment that happened, and along with Justin Bailey, that opens up 1-2 spots, even with the addition of Kevin Hayes. So right now, the Lions could look something like this: Drew, Couturier, and connecting on that top line, as it should be, as it's proven to be well performing. JVR, Kevin Hayes, Jake Voracek on the second line, Oscar Lindblom, Nolan Patrick on the third line with, maybe Morgan Frost or Joel Farabee. Fourth line, Raffle, Lawton, and the other winger spot is kind of up to the younger players. Kind of like you said, they're hungry. They want to prove that they can be in the NHL sooner rather than later. There was certainly the idea by both Morgan Frost and Joel Farabee that they want to start their Flyers careers sooner rather than later. Of course, they're both very, very young. Morgan Frost, during his draft year, I think he was like somewhere around 170, something like that, 175. He's bulked up to 185, and his goal is to get to 190. So the fact that he said he needs to bulk up more and everything and get stronger, he's proven that. He's shown that. You can tell on the ice his skills are still there. They're phenomenal, and I certainly think that Morgan Frost will make a huge, huge stride to either making the team or just missing the team this year, just because there's, for some reason, another player that they like over Frost just for now, or they might not think he's ready yet, which is totally fine too. The kid is 20 years old. This is going to be his first year in the pros, regardless, whether it's in the NHL or the AHL. For Farabee, he is, I think, 19. However, the fact that he signed his contract, and I know there's a difference between the NCAA and in juniors. If you sign your contract, even when you're 19, you can go in the NHL or AHL. You don't have to go back to juniors. So, and the same thing with NCAA. Once you sign that contract, you're gone. So you're in the pros. But I really like those two. I think they can make a big difference. And then kind of going now to the defensive side, Shane Gostisbehere, and again, just more of the offseason moves. I'm glad that Chuck Fletcher stayed put on all the Gostisbehere rumors. There's so many rumors of him going to Montreal for Andrew Shaw and somebody else and all these ridiculous trade rumors. It's not worth it, because the type of contract that Gostisbehere is on, it's unbelievable what type of contract he got. And it's amazing, kind of a steal, really, the fact that Shane Gostisbehere is on this type of contract. The one thing that I am glad, though, is, like you said, Kevin, this will certainly be, well, at least to me, this will be a refreshing start for Gostisbehere, because no more Dave Haxel, who I think kind of had a string, it was pulling a string a bit on the back of his jersey, pulling him back a bit, because you could tell the last year and a half or so, he hasn't looked like his normal high flying self. Now, 2 years ago, he was all over the place. He put up 17 goals. His 17 and Provorov's 13, that was a combined 30 out of the 55 goals that defensemen scored just 2 years ago. That's the type of defenseman that the Flyers need from both Ivan Provorov and Shane Gostisbehere. But the fact that I think Rick Wilson's now gone, nothing against him, but obviously he did not see eye to eye with Gostisbehere. An article written back in May by Jordan Hall of NBC Sports Philadelphia, here was a section of on Gostisbehere from Elliot Freeman's 31 thoughts that Hall included in his article. Wilson did not mention Shane Gostisbehere, so I brought him up. He was careful. I would just say that I'm a little disappointed. I couldn't help him bring more of his best on a consistent basis. He's very talented, and it is in there. Now, for Gostisbehere, he kind of had some comments on it. So he said, with Rick coming in and different coaches and whatnot, that they tweaked the style. Not just me personally, but how he wants the defense to play. I wouldn't say they put handcuffs on me or anything, but they pulled the reins back quite a bit, just in what they wanted us to do collectively as a D core. Now, right there, that kind of scares me a bit. The fact that Gostisbehere says they're basically pulling the reins back on us, not just me as a whole, but not just me, but the defensive core as a whole. So I think as effective assistant coach as Rick Wilson was, it's kind of nice to see a new face for the defensive side for Philadelphia coming up.
Yeah, and I think I'll throw in there this too. You know, Travis Sanheim really blossomed under Rick Wilson. And at the same time, if you give every single defenseman that you really have pinned a lot of hopes to, especially from an offensive standpoint, Provorov, Sanheim, Gostisbehere, all three of them probably get a more reliable defensive partner this year. Or at least you hope so. You hope that if Provorov plays next to, let's say, Niskanen, that he gets a more reliable partner in that. And Sanheim plays next to Braun, he gets a more reliable partner. And Gostisbehere plays next to Phil Myers, he gets a more reliable partner. And throughout that, if that allows them to have the freedom to not pull on the reins with them when they want to carry the puck through the neutral zone and try to create an entry, or jump up in the play a little more often and be that offensive presence. That's really part of the specialty of their game, especially Gostisbehere's. You need a guy who is able to do that and feel free to jump up there, because that's when he's at his best. I was actually, just because I guess maybe because I was bored on one of the days leading up to free agency, but I was watching a few of the highlights from some of the games from last year. And every time Gostisbehere scored a goal, it seemed like he was coming up as a trailer on a play or something like that. He didn't score a lot of goals last year, but I don't recall seeing a lot of goals in the first place that were the traditional power play goal from the point. A lot of it was jumping up in the rush, taking a pass from somebody as a trailer, and being able to unleash a shot that was kind of unexpected. He had one in overtime last year that was in a way similar, because it was a kind of a miniature 2-on-1. It was, he was on transition plays a lot to score goals. That's kind of his thing, is to be able to use his mobility to his advantage. And if you don't let him do that, I think he becomes a very ineffective player, because you need him to be moving his feet constantly, to be on the go as constantly as possible. Even from a defensive standpoint, I think he plays better defensively when he's back checking more than when he's caught standing still, and he can't adjust quick enough. That proves to be worse sometimes. So I'd like to see all three pairings get a little bit of that freedom where they get to move up and jump into the play a little bit more often. I think that could go a long way in the Flyers' offensive success, especially if they want to get back to where they were, a few years ago, when they had a lot of contributing defensemen. I think you can still have that. I think that not only would Gostisbehere would be due for a bounce back season, Provorov's due for one. Sanheim showed a lot of promise that you hope continues. I think Myers could certainly have a little bit more of an offensive presence as well than what he was able to show in the brief time he was up at the NHL last year. And I don't think it's beyond Niskanen and Braun to put up some numbers, not anything drastic, but some, modest numbers. I think there's potential for kind of all of them in a sense. Now, I do want to start to shift gears over to kind of, we've talked a lot about the state of the Flyers and the guys they've brought back and the guys that they've brought in, and kind of how that set themselves up for the upcoming season. The fact that they made their decisions long before free agency started on Monday. So what about what everybody else was doing? And it was certainly a busy Monday for a lot of other teams, and that was what kind of made it frustrating for a lot of people, was that the Flyers were out there building out their AHL roster while other teams were making their big additions. And in some cases, just from my vantage point, and I'll get yours in a second, Jeff, my vantage point was that a lot of the players that signed on Monday, at least the big players, kind of had their minds made up way before we got to Monday, and had their minds made up so much to a point where I think that what the deals that they got were not really accurate for what they would have gotten anywhere else on the market. I look at Artemi Panarin's deal, and I think Panarin made a lot of money. There was no doubting that was going to happen. But I look at it and I go, if he took a pay cut to play with the Rangers, then he wanted to play with the Rangers. There really was no negotiating about it. He wanted to play with the New York Rangers. Simple as that. Same thing, Matt Duchene. I saw a lot of comparisons of Matt Duchene's contract to Kevin Hayes' contract because it was so close in average annual value. We had sat here a week ago thinking Duchene was going to end up getting upwards of $9, maybe $10 million a year, because he was certainly kind of in a little bit of what felt like a higher class than Kevin Hayes was from a point production standpoint, for sure. And Duchesne gets a deal that's an average annual value of $8 million, and you get people out there going, whoa, wait a minute, what happened here? How come he made less than $1 million more than Kevin Hayes, and that's what the Flyers paid for him? There's circumstances to everything. Duchesne loves the idea of playing in Nashville, has always loved the idea, has wanted to for a long time. He's building a house there currently, and there's no state income tax. So any deal, the $8 million deal in Nashville was a $9.5 million deal anywhere else if you really wanted him to play for you that bad. And I don't even know if there was any changing his mind. Guys, things like that. To see other guys, I don't think there was really a surprise that Sergei Bobrovsky ended up in Florida. That was kind of the goal all the way through, was that Florida was going to go out and try to make a big splash and do so with one of these players from Columbus, preferably Panarin or Bobrovsky, and they ended up with Bobrovsky. Wayne Simmons to New Jersey is an interesting one. Didn't expect him to get the money he did out of that contract. It's definitely a show-me contract, and I have no doubts he'll be motivated. To see two really big veterans who spent a lot of time on the West Coast end up in Dallas, Joe Pavelski and Corey Perry, getting deals in Dallas. It's going to be interesting to see them wearing somebody else's uniform next year, but certainly something that's going to be different. I found interesting that for a long time it seemed like Panarin was going to go to the Islanders, and that was a very much a last day kind of switch leading up to the start of free agency, and that the Islanders at that point then had to scramble back to re-sign Anders Lee to keep him with the team. They added Semyon Varlamov as well, and Robin Lehner goes to Chicago. So kind of bouncing around effect there. And then Peter Mrazek also stayed with Carolina. There were a bunch of others too. We could go through all of them if we wanted to, but we probably don't have the time to go through everybody's signing. Those were just some of the significant ones. Before I go into kind of the scope of the Metropolitan Division and something I certainly there's something I wanted to point out that I noticed, but also just those free agent deals and your thoughts on some of those or any others that stood out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the biggest things is that Columbus lost a good amount of players. They lost Matt Duchene. They lost Sergei Bobrovsky, Artemi Panarin. I believe they lost, or they're at least going to lose Ryan Dzingel. There's a lot of key pieces that they've had, but also gained at the trade deadline that they lost. But the one big thing for them is they got Gustav Nyquist, and I thought that was a pretty big addition for them there. So I don't count their free agency as a total loss because they did lose out on quite a bit. And then Jonas Donskoy, one of my favorite free agents right there. He went to Colorado on a 4-year deal, 15.6 mil with a 3.9 mil cap hit. I thought that was a good move there. But all in all, there's some real big contracts, some surprising, some not. I think it was more so the length in terms. And then there is one that I was a little surprised by contract wise. The player, not so much. In Brandon Tanev to the Pittsburgh Penguins, 6 years, 21 mil, 3.5 mil cap hit. I'm okay with the player in Brandon Tanev. I think he's a good, solid bottom six player. It's just I think Jim Rutherford unfortunately paid a little too much, and honestly overpaid to get Tanev because I wasn't expecting him to get nearly that much money.
Yeah, there was a lot of activity in general, and I was surprised at a lot of the term for a lot of players. I wanted to run down kind of the scope of the Metropolitan Division because I'll echo what you said about Columbus for a second first. I do like the Nyquist signing for them. I really do. At the same time, this team is not going to be the same as it was a year ago. They made their all-in move basically by getting Duchesne, then getting Dzingel, then putting it all together. And well, actually, I shouldn't say by just getting those two, but by also keeping Panarin and keeping Bobrovsky in advance of an offseason where they had to know that this was probably coming. And now they've lost Panarin, they've lost Duchesne, they've lost Bobrovsky. They're probably going to lose Dzingel. And without those guys, they're not a terrible team up front. Nyquist certainly gives them a good piece. Dubois is a good player. Atkinson's a good player. Anderson's a good player. They've got good players. But Panarin was a big difference maker for that team. He made everybody on that team better. I think Duchesne was starting to do a little bit of the same, and I think now they're going to really have to heavily rely on Dubois and on Atkinson, and I just don't know if they're going to get, I don't know that they're going to get the all-star numbers out of Atkinson like they did before, and I don't know if they're going to get, Dubois is going to grow and continue to be a better player, but does he have the support system around him where they don't become an easy team to eliminate because if you can take out their first line, maybe they become an easier team to beat. Who knows? But I certainly, and not only that, but I think, they've got to re-sign Zach Werenski, who's a restricted free agent. They've got Seth Jones, and I think those are good pieces to their defense. But the goaltending hole is noticeable now. I mean, nothing against Korpisalo in Columbus, but I think there's times where you can be a really good backup, and when the pressure starts to fall on you as the go-to guy, you almost, you wonder if he's got that in him. And I'm not going to sit here and say he doesn't for sure, but that's one of those gambles that we're talking about where you had Keith Kincaid within your system and a guy who had some good starting experience could have stuck with him. Instead, they let him go as well. And you're bringing in kind of an unknown backup here to be a backup to Korpisalo. I think it's going to be interesting to see if they're able to do what they have done for the last few years because they had the luxury of having a Vezina goaltender in Bobrovsky behind them. They had a superstar player in Panarin, and with all that going on, I think Columbus takes a huge hit. One of the other things I want to bring up out of the division that really doesn't affect anything crazy for next year, but it was interesting to see there was actually an offer sheet. And Sebastian Aho gets signed to an offer sheet by Montreal. Carolina matches it, obviously. It wasn't that big of an offer that it was impossible to match. It was certainly not on Shea Weber to the Flyers level. But Aho's a great player, and of course you're going to match an offer like that. Outside of that, I didn't really see a whole lot from them. They had to get a goaltender, basically, and they re-signed Mrazek. They traded for James Reimer, but I didn't see a whole lot of other activity beyond that. So it's relatively the same team hold for a decision by Justin Williams to either return to playing or re-sign with Carolina, which apparently he's leaning towards re-signing. Those things to me, it's not that Carolina was a really upstart team last year, and when the playoffs hit, they really bonded together and turned in a couple good, one really good or two really good series, I should say, before it kind of all came crashing down against Boston. And I just wonder if they get the same kind of momentum next year as they move forward with this. And, because a lot of their success was predicated on goaltending when they had it, or getting good goal scoring from guys like Teravainen or even Jordan Staal. Aho was obviously the big contributor. It's just a matter of if they get all that and can be that same team that really just rides a wave of momentum all the way through next season like they did this past season. The Islanders did a good job of circling back to get Anders Lee, but again, and they got Varlamov as well. But again, the idea that the Islanders were, maybe 3 hours away from becoming significantly better with a guy like Panarin and then didn't get him. Now they're kind of also rolling back a very similar team. And that's something that I kind of noticed. I'm not going to sit here and say that there's a big difference between the Islanders and Hurricanes to me. I think the Islanders are far more established of a playoff team at this point with the coaching staff they have, with all of the players collectively that they have. I think Carolina's got some guys who stepped up big time, notably goaltending, and that's something to kind of be mindful of. And then, Washington and Pittsburgh really didn't have major activity. Pittsburgh got Tanev. Washington ends up losing Connolly and gets, and goes back. They get Richard Panik. So that was a pretty good cost-effective deal. Kind of, a deal that is trying to replace that player, essentially. It's really only the Rangers and Devils that made the significant upgrades. The Devils go out and the Devils made their bigger upgrades realistically before free agency as well, because they go out and they end up with the first overall pick, so they get Jack Hughes. They end up making a trade for PK Subban. Those are the moves that get you moving forward a little bit better. And then, they add on a guy like Simmons, who can certainly have an impact with that team. He's a good veteran to have, but I just wonder what version of Wayne Simmons you're going to get with the Devils. Are you going to get the guy who was an all-star player and bounces back and shows everybody that we were all wrong about him being kind of done at this point? Or is he the guy who ends up being done? That's what we have to wait and see. The Rangers obviously were the big winners throughout the whole thing, because not only did they get Panarin, but they managed to work things over throughout the entire offseason that made them better. They get a good spot in the lottery, so they get Capo Caco, and they complete the trade to get Jacob Trouba, and they find a way to do all of those things and kind of give you something shiny and new at every point. A new forward, a new defenseman, another forward who was drafted, so he's going to be a homegrown player. I think that all applies and works really well for them. One of the things that I kind of noticed that I found a little bit ironic as free agency went on, though, is that the one thing that the Flyers had, because there's a lot of people who would look and go, the Rangers got Panarin, Flyers are down on them now, and the Devils got Subban and Hughes, and with you can do the same thing with the Rangers with Capo Caco. They got these players, so now that the Flyers falling behind because they didn't make those kind of upgrades. And I found it funny because I started to go through and it was kind of when there was an idea out there that Carolina was losing one of the goaltenders they had in kind of a tandem form from last season. The Islanders were about to lose one as well. Columbus had lost a goaltender, and you're starting to wonder what the goaltending situation looks like for every team in the division. And there's really, kind of in a weird way, it turned out that the Flyers were one of three teams that could kind of look at their goaltending situation and find it stable in some semblance of the previous season. That the Capitals are always going to have Braden Holtby, and the Penguins have Matt Murray, and the Flyers have Carter Hart now, and Columbus has to turn to the guy who was the backup to Bobrovsky, and Carolina had to eventually scramble to re-sign Mrazek, but got James Reimer, who had been a backup, and the Islanders had to sign Varlamov to play alongside of Greiss, but Lehner was one of the best goalies in the league last year, and the Rangers have an aging Henrik Lundqvist who hasn't really looked like himself in the past two seasons. The Devils have Corey Schneider, who has gone through battles with injury throughout, and it led to other goalies getting a chance. And the Devils have a young goalie too. They've got Mackenzie Blackwood, who could certainly come in and become the starter at some point. But the bottom line being, a lot of these teams suffered from the back end, where the Flyers are going to get a full season out of Carter Hart and presumably get better in that category. When I look at the entire scope of these teams in the Eastern Conference, one of the things I think that sticks out to me is that I don't think anything has shifted in the balance of power for the top three teams in each division, even if they weren't very active on day one of free agency. I don't think Washington's out of the top three in the Metro. I don't think Pittsburgh's out of the top three in the Metro. And I don't think the Islanders are out of the top three in the Metro, at least for now. You've got five teams in the Metro who are certainly bubble teams at this point. The Rangers have improved enough that they could make some sort of noise. The Devils have improved enough that they can make a lot of noise. The Flyers have been kind of in between in the last few years. They make it, they don't. They make it, they don't. Carolina had a great run last year, but only made it as a wild card team. So bear in mind that from a regular season standpoint, they have to put it together the whole time. And Columbus now takes kind of a significant hit after being a wild card team because they don't have the goaltending now that they had last year. They don't have two of the forwards that were impact players from last year or parts of it. So it changes the outcome for them possibly. I go to the Atlantic, same thing. Boston's still up there. Tampa Bay's still up there. Toronto's still up there. Florida made some significant improvements, and I kind of, from last year's standings, I keep the same three top teams and I keep the same three bottom teams. I keep Detroit, Buffalo, and Ottawa still at the bottom. I keep Boston, Tampa Bay, and Toronto at the top. I've kind of flip-flopped Montreal and Florida because I think Florida made enough improvements that they are now going to be a team to watch that could potentially take a wild card spot. And if they do, only four teams from the Metro are probably finding their way in, and that could be significant. There's a chance Montreal could be better next year too and find a way to make that difficult. So it's really hard to see where you're going to get 8 playoff teams from probably about 10 teams, 10, 12 teams that could really, really be significantly better next year. Anywhere from anywhere from modestly better to significantly better. So I think all of that makes it a very interesting upcoming season. But I do think that I think there's something to look at when you look at the rest of the division. And yes, there's a lot of teams in the division that got better forwards out of this at some point. The Rangers got better up front. The Devils maybe got a little bit better up front. The Penguins got probably a little bit better up front after the Kessel trade for Galchenyuk. The Capitals still have a lot of talent up front, not necessarily getting better up front, but they have a lot of talent there. The Islanders, have talent up front. The Hurricanes have talent up front. Columbus kind of lost that, and that's where I saw them slip. Goaltending was another area where I saw a lot of teams in the Metro possibly slip. Those are things that I find significant, and I think that could play into the Flyers' favor a little bit. Jeff, your thoughts on kind of the outlook of the division and the conference in general as well, and anything else from around the league that kind of signifies any other teams making kind of big jumps as well.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to start in the Atlantic just because that's the most predictable division, in my opinion, in the Eastern Conference. Tampa Bay, Boston, Toronto. It's those three teams. It has been for the past 2 years or so. It's going to be those three teams for the next few years as well. Buffalo, Detroit, Ottawa. I think they might flip around a bit. I'm expecting a bit of a better effort. Not necessarily effort. Let me rephrase that. Bit of a better outcome this year than the last few years for Detroit. Steve Yzerman is their GM again. I truly do think that he can help turn their franchise around and kind of bring them to the point where I feel like they should be at. Buffalo, it's a tough situation. We'll see what happens. Florida and Montreal, they've both made significant changes. Florida, they get Quenville, they get Bobrovsky. Montreal, they draft Cole Caulfield, which I think is a big piece. And of course, there's some other pieces there in Montreal as well. But it's really the top three in Tampa Bay, Boston, Toronto. Those three are the powerhouse teams in the Atlantic, and that's going to stay put. Now, for the Metro, I have always believed that this is honestly one of the toughest divisions to play in. Look how many great teams you have here, and literally just look at the competition for the playoff spots. Washington 104 points, the Islanders 103, Pittsburgh 100, Carolina 99, Columbus 98. It took all the teams at least 98 points or above just to make the playoffs. And the fact that the lowest team in the Metro was Columbus at 98 points. If you look at teams, if you have a 98 point season in the Pacific Division, you're the third seed team. If you're in the Central, you're right there in the mix, very close to number 2 and 3. If you're there in the Atlantic, that's a bit of a different story because the other three teams were dominant. But 98 points, that's almost not good enough in the Metropolitan Division. That's why I think if any team wants to try out the playoffs in the Metro, they're going to have a 100 point season or higher. 98 points, that's barely just enough to make you a playoff team for a wild card. Each team certainly added pieces. Each team, I think, lost pieces. Pittsburgh, they lost Phil Kessel, but they got Galchenyuk. They also got Pierre-Olivier Joseph, who I think can be a pretty solid defenseman years down the road. The Islanders, they were actually one of the few teams that I hadn't noticed do a whole lot. I was pretty surprised. Of course, they do have now Varlamov, which I thought it was a very big piece for them, considering the fact that Robert Leonard left. After Artemi Panarin announced that he was going to the Rangers, they had to kick tires back with Anders Lee because they knew they were missing out on Panarin. There's a lot of pieces there. Matthew Barzal, he's going to be a full-on force for that team. Josh Bailey, Andrew Ladd is still there. Casey Cizikas. There's a lot of pieces there in the Islanders organization that can certainly help them. The coaching staff, that's all good as well. Carolina, they are a young team. They're trying to get younger as well. They have a good mix of veterans and young forwards. I'm curious to see how Andrei Svechnikov will do in his second season. And I'm extremely excited for the Hurricanes' future. I think they're right there in the mix as well, and they're becoming another team that can be a possible dangerous team if they are able to kind of carry the same momentum they did last year. For the Rangers, they obviously added Capo Caco, Jacob Trouba, Artemi Panarin now. Those are three pretty big pieces right there. It doesn't guarantee them a playoff spot, but I think it won't guarantee you any team anybody, or sorry, any team anything. It can show promise. It can show to the team, hey, this is what we have, but this is why we play the games. You have to play all 82 games to get to the playoffs. And look at Tampa Bay. 62 wins. They were swept in the first round. So you gotta make enough moves. You gotta make the right moves to get to the playoffs. Because once you're in the playoffs, anything can happen. The Devils, they obviously have Jack Hughes now. Traded for PK Subban. That was huge. Wayne Simmons they added. That's a good piece there. A good depth forward they can have. Not only that, but now they have someone to potentially protect Jack Hughes if need be. Or if they would like, throw Simmons on that top line with Jack Hughes, or even on Nico Hischier's line to protect him as well. Obviously, we know what type of player Simmons is, and you gotta respect it. You gotta respect the type of player he is, and I obviously just wish him all the best of luck. Now for Philadelphia, they did add some significant pieces in Kevin Hayes. They bolstered up on their defense a little bit. I think it's enough to kind of push them up and over the edge just a little bit more. You need more production from some of the younger guys. I know some of the young guys like Oscar Lindblom, he did very well. Travis Sanheim, he did good. He did really, really good. And that's why I'm kind of expecting even more from Sanheim this year. You have some veteran presence in the defensemen in Justin Braun and Matt Niskanen. Those are big pieces to add for the younger guys in Philadelphia to help kind of mentor them, help coach them. Brian Elliott's still there behind Carter Hart in net. They have a good relationship there. It's not the greatest tandem, but hey, it's not bad. It's a lot better than I was expecting it to be. Obviously, Hart is going to be a sensational goalie, and Elliott, who knows how long he's here for, but in the meantime, he can certainly take off the pressure of Carter Hart. He can teach him another trick or two here and there, take some games off of his slate, and we'll see what happens. But I really do think that the Metro is the toughest division out there because of how close it is. You really need 100 plus points just to make the playoffs, even if you're just above a wild card position.
Yeah, and that's why I wasn't going to go so far as to talk about the Flyers and say whether or not, is it a playoff team? Is it not a playoff team? I wasn't going to go that far because it's an incredibly competitive division. And how do you make the playoffs out of the Metropolitan Division? You win games against the teams within your division. And if the Flyers are going to be successful, they're going to have to win games against, maybe they're going to have to win games against Columbus now that they maybe don't have a goaltender who you feel like can steal them one, like Bobrovsky was capable of doing and seemed to do a lot against the Flyers. Maybe you are able to win games against Carolina, for whatever, for reasons, for different reasons. Maybe Pittsburgh takes a little bit of a step back. It's too early to tell with all this stuff. There's, things happen over the course of a season, and you're always somebody's always one injury away from something significant happening. And, sometimes I feel like some of the players, look, I think the Rangers got significantly better with a player like Panarin, but sometimes I think we lose touch with the fact that Trouba was one of the best defensemen that might have been on the move this offseason, but not, I don't think you can classify Trouba right now the same way you classify an Erik Karlsson, and Erik Karlsson never made it to market either. That would have been a totally different story. So I think you have to be mindful that upgrades are upgrades in a big way by what they look like on paper and by what they look like when you consider what else was available. And you still, like I said from the beginning, you still have to play the games. And I'm curious to see how this team's style stacks up against the rest of the Metro specifically. And more than that, I think I'm glad that when you look at the schedule, they get to play New Jersey in the second game of the year. I think that's great. And I think that it's a shame that they have to wait as long as they do sometimes to play teams, that you'd like to see them get tested against sooner rather than later. Now at the same time, I look and they play New Jersey, the Islanders, and Pittsburgh, all within the first month. They have New Jersey again in the first month. They get Carolina in there in November. They get Washington in November. Islanders again in there. Columbus is in November. So while I'd love to see them get the Rangers a lot sooner than almost the end of December, I like the idea that you're going to see them play a lot of the teams within the division. You're going to see them play Washington and Pittsburgh and the Islanders and the Devils and Columbus and Carolina and get at least one game in against those teams. But it does make for a tough schedule to start with, because I do think it's weird. The Metro is a very competitive division, but I think the West is competitive across all fronts. It's pretty significant when you're talking about teams like, Winnipeg losing as much as they did. The trade of Trouba, they lost Tyler Myers, they lose Kevin Hayes, all of that. You talk about that type of stuff, and you see other teams that, in the West. I think Colorado took some steps forward. San Jose made a great deal with restricted free agent Timo Meier that I think helps them in the long run. There's a lot of things that teams are doing right. Chicago made a lot of upgrades, and that's your first game of the season. So you look at where those teams were a year ago, and it makes that conference that much tougher. And with a lot of games against that conference, the beginning is going to be the most important thing, and you can afford to against the other conference. I think it's very important to note this. You can afford against the other conference to get caught in tight games that may require extra time. It's not a problem to get the points that way if you have to. It's just a matter of getting the points. And when it comes time to play these teams within your division, that's when you need to start really showing that you are above these teams. But it's going to take more than just the next couple of months to get there, where you're waiting for it to start. Players are going to train over the next 2 months. They're going to start getting ready, and then they're going to go to training camp, and they're going to have to learn the systems quickly, and they're going to have kind of a strange preseason, because they're going to complete the training camp preseason portion of a lot of this in a matter of 2 weeks and head off to Europe. So it's going to make for something strange, and when it all starts back up, we will certainly be here with you to break it all down throughout the season. So that is going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We are on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly Podcast Network. Remember, you can listen to us and shows on the rest of Philly sports through the podcast network. We are now off for the summer. We're going to take kind of a well-deserved break from all the writing, all of the stuff we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. And we'll be back in September to start previewing the season at that point. So we'll come back right around the start of rookie camp, leading into training camp, and be with you from there until the rest of the season. For any discussion that may come out of the re-signings over the summer that the Flyers have, whether, whenever Ivan Provorov signs or Travis Konechny signs, whatever the deals are, I will do new episodes of the Daily Flyer. I put one of those out in between the draft and the free agency podcasts we did over the last few weeks. I'll put those out to kind of just briefly discuss some stuff with that. But as a group, we will be back following the remainder of summer. So once again, thank you for tuning in. For Jeff Quake, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com and 97.3 ESPN. You have been listening to another episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com and 97.3 ESPN.